Generations before modern gardening stores existed, the Amish built thriving gardens using nothing but time-tested traditions and natural wisdom. These 15 forgotten tricks can bring that same natural abundance into your own garden. These hacks aren't just clever, they save money, enrich the soil, and keep plants healthier without chemicals. Soap shaving pest trick. The Amish have been grating bars of homemade lye soap around their cabbage and squash plants for generations, and there's solid reasoning behind this peculiar practice. That strong, sharp scent that rises from freshly grated soap creates an invisible barrier that slugs and beetles absolutely despise. These garden pests rely heavily on their sense of smell to locate their next meal, and when they encounter that powerful soap aroma, they turn right around and head elsewhere. The beauty of this method lies in its simplicity and accessibility. Amish families produce soap in bulk quantities throughout the year anyway, so they're not making special trips or spending extra money on pest control products. They're just redirecting what they already have in abundance towards solving a garden problem. This tradition traces its roots back to the early Pennsylvania Dutch farms, where European settlers brought their old country wisdom and adapted it to American soil. Those early farmers didn't have access to garden centers or chemical sprays, so they got creative with household items. The soap trick worked then, and it still works now. What makes this especially clever is the dual purpose it serves. Not only does the soap repel pests, but as rain gradually dissolves those soap shavings into the soil, they break down into components that don't harm the plants or the earth. There's no toxic residue, no waiting period before harvest, and no concern about beneficial insects being wiped out alongside the pests. Some modern gardeners spend more on pest control than their grandparents spent on their entire grocery bill. The method is so straightforward that even children can help with the grading, turning pest management into a family activity rather than a chemical application that requires gloves and warning labels. When you walk through an Amish garden in early summer, you might notice those white flecks scattered around the base of brassicas and cucurbits, and now you'll know exactly what you're looking at. It's not some fancy organic product ordered from a catalog. It's just soap, doing what soap has done in Amish gardens for well over a century, keeping plants healthy and pests frustrated without a single ingredient that anyone can't pronounce. Molasses bug bait. Setting out shallow pans or old jars filled with molasses mixed into water has become second nature in Amish communities, especially once the beetles start emerging in late spring. The sweet, sticky liquid acts like a magnet for Japanese beetles, cucumber beetles, and various other hard-shelled pests that can devastate bean rows and corn plantings overnight. Amish gardeners position these traps strategically at garden edges where beetles typically enter, creating a first line of defense before the insects ever reach the valuable crops. The method works because beetles are drawn to fermentation smells and sweet scents, and molasses delivers both in abundance. Once they land on the surface of that sticky mixture, their legs get trapped, and they can't escape. Some beetles travel miles looking for a good meal and end up taking their last swim in a mason jar of molasses. By morning, you'll find dozens of beetles drowned in each container, which gets emptied and refilled as needed throughout the growing season. The cost comparison between this approach and commercial pest control products is almost laughable. A single jar of molasses might cost a couple of dollars and last for weeks of trap making, while beetle sprays and powders can run $10 to $15 per bottle and get used up quickly. For Amish families operating on tight budgets and valuing thrift as a spiritual principle, that difference matters enormously. But beyond the financial aspect, there's a safety factor that can't be ignored. Molasses is something you could technically eat straight from the jar without any harm, which means it poses zero threat to children playing nearby, chickens wandering through the garden, or family dogs investigating interesting smells. Compare that to chemical pesticides that require skull and crossbones warnings and careful storage away from living areas. What really highlights Amish ingenuity is how this practice demonstrates their broader philosophy of turning pantry staples into field tools. They look at a jar of molasses and see not just a baking ingredient, but a potential solution to multiple problems. That same resourcefulness shows up in dozens of other garden practices where common household items get repurposed in unexpected ways. The beetle traps stay out all season, getting refreshed every few days, and the captured insects often get fed to chickens, which closes another loop in the farm ecosystem. Nothing gets wasted. Every input serves multiple purposes, and the garden stays productive without depending on products manufactured far away and shipped in at considerable expense. Milk spray for mildew. Raw milk diluted with water and misted onto cucumber and melon vines might sound like an odd garden treatment, but the Amish discovered generations ago that it stops powdery mildew dead in its tracks. This fungal disease shows up as white, dusty patches on leaves and spreads rapidly in humid conditions, eventually weakening vines so much that fruit production drops dramatically. Once mildew takes hold, it's incredibly difficult to reverse without chemical fungicides, which is exactly why prevention matters so much. The Amish approach involves mixing 1 part raw milk with 9 parts water, then spraying it onto vine crops every week or two throughout the growing season. The proteins and beneficial bacteria in raw milk create an environment on the leaf surface where mildew spores simply can't establish themselves. Scientists who've studied this method have confirmed that certain compounds in milk actually have antifungal properties, though the Amish figured this out through observation and experimentation long before any laboratory research backed it up. For Amish dairy families, this practice makes even more practical sense because they often have surplus milk that's approaching the end of its freshness. Rather than letting that milk go completely to waste, they redirect it into the garden where it serves a protective function. A gallon of milk that's gotten a bit too sour for drinking can treat a considerable amount of vine crops, turning a potential loss into a garden asset. Trying to explain to your suburban neighbor why you're spraying milk on your cucumbers is almost as hard as explaining why you're talking to your tomatoes. The timing of application matters quite a bit. Starting these milk sprays early in the season before any mildew appears gives much better results than waiting until you see the white patches and then trying to treat an active infection. Prevention beats treatment every single time. The method extends the productive life of cucumber and melon vines well into late summer when humidity levels typically surge. Vines that would normally start declining in August keep pushing out new flowers and fruit through September, which translates directly into more jars of pickles in the cellar and more melons for fresh eating and preserving. That extended harvest window can make the difference between abundance and scarcity in the winter months ahead. The only product we'll ever promote on our channel is a book by Claude Davis, a veteran prepper, about 126 superfoods and preservation methods from crisis times like the Great Depression and wartime that are impossible to find elsewhere. We decided to promote his book because we are the last generation able to share these techniques and superfoods to our children or grandchildren. It would be a shame to see this information about highly nutritious foods and preservation methods to survive crises disappear. You can also find a book about herbal remedies from Nicole Apelian on their store. If you're watching this on TV, you can look up our channel, Frugal Solutions, on your phone or tablet and find the books by clicking the link in our channel description or any other video description. Nettle tea fertilizer. Collecting stinging nettles might seem like a masochistic garden chore, but Amish gardeners have long valued these aggressive weeds as the foundation for powerful liquid fertilizer. The process starts with harvesting nettles while wearing thick gloves, chopping them roughly, and stuffing them into a large bucket or barrel. Water gets added to cover the plant material completely, and then the mixture sits for anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks, fermenting and breaking down into a dark, pungent liquid that gardeners affectionately call liquid green manure. The smell that develops during this steeping process is definitely memorable and not in a pleasant way, something between compost and swamp water, but Amish growers tolerate the stench because they know what's coming. Once the nettle tea is ready, it gets diluted again with water at about a 1-to-10 ratio and poured directly at the base of tomato plants, bean rows, and other heavy feeders. The nutrient boost is immediate and dramatic, with plants showing darker green foliage and increased vigor within just a few days of application. Nettles accumulate nitrogen in their tissues at remarkably high concentrations, much higher than most other common weeds, which makes them particularly valuable for creating this fertilizer. The only garden ingredient that fights back during harvest is probably worth its weight in nitrogen. They also pull up trace minerals from deep in the soil through their extensive root systems, concentrating elements like iron, magnesium, and calcium that get transferred into the tea and then into your garden plants. This traditional method eliminates the need for commercial fertilizers entirely, which matters greatly to Amish communities that prefer self-sufficiency and avoiding dependence on outside suppliers. The practice originated in Europe, where nettle tea fertilizer has been used for centuries in cottage gardens and small farms. Amish immigrants brought this knowledge with them across the Atlantic and kept it alive even as mainstream American agriculture shifted toward synthetic inputs. Today, while industrial farms rely on petroleum-based nitrogen fertilizers, Amish gardens thrive on what essentially amounts to weed soup. The tea can be applied every 2 to 3 weeks throughout the growing season without any risk of burning plants or creating toxic buildup in the soil. If anything, repeated applications improve soil structure and feed beneficial microorganisms that contribute to overall garden health. The whole system operates on waste-not principles, turning an invasive nuisance plant into garden gold through nothing more than water and time. Rusty nail. Tomato booster. Burying rusty nails or old iron scraps near the base of tomato plants remains a quietly persistent tradition in Amish tomato patches, even though some outsiders dismiss it as folk superstition. The practice rests on the belief that iron somehow strengthens tomato vines and deepens the flavor of the fruit. And while that might sound like agricultural folklore, there's actually some science backing it up. Tomatoes do need iron for proper chlorophyll production and overall plant vigor, and rusty iron slowly oxidizes in the soil, releasing iron ions that plant roots can absorb. Whether this actually improves tomato flavor is harder to prove, but generations of Amish gardeners swear they can taste the difference between tomatoes grown with buried iron and those grown without it. The only thing better than free fertilizer is free fertilizer you can pull out of your burn barrel. Beyond the nutritional aspect, this practice brilliantly recycles barn waste that would otherwise sit in scrap piles or get hauled to the dump. Amish farms accumulate bent nails, broken horseshoes, worn-out hinges, and all manner of iron debris from building repairs and equipment maintenance. Instead of viewing these items as trash, they become soil amendments that might help the next tomato crop. That mindset of turning everything into a resource, of seeing potential value in what others discard, runs deep in Amish agricultural philosophy. The amount of iron needed isn't massive. 2 or 3 rusty nails buried 6 inches from a tomato seedling apparently suffices, though some gardeners go further and bury entire horseshoes or sections of chain. As the growing season progresses and irrigation water moves through the soil, rust gradually flakes off and disperses, making iron available throughout the root zone. The process is slow and gentle, avoiding the kind of nutrient shock that can happen with heavy fertilizer applications. Modern soil tests occasionally reveal that many garden soils are actually deficient in available iron, particularly in areas with alkaline pH levels that lock up iron compounds. The rusty nail method addresses this deficiency without requiring soil test kits, pH adjustments, or specialty chelated iron products from the garden center. It's intuitive, practical, and costs absolutely nothing beyond the effort of pushing a few old nails into the ground during planting. Whether the resulting tomatoes truly taste better might be partly subjective, but the vines certainly seem to appreciate the extra iron, producing darker green foliage and heavier fruit set. Chamomile seedling tonic. Brewing chamomile tea for tender seedlings instead of drinking it yourself might seem like a waste of perfectly good tea. But the Amish recognized long ago that chamomile possesses gentle antifungal properties that protect young plants during their most vulnerable stage. The condition called damping off, where seedlings suddenly collapse and die at soil level due to fungal infection, can wipe out entire trays of starts overnight. It strikes without warning, thrives in the cool, damp conditions of early spring, and spreads rapidly from one seedling to its neighbors. Once damping off takes hold, there's no saving the affected plants, which makes prevention absolutely critical. The chamomile tea method involves brewing a strong batch just like you would for drinking, letting it cool completely, and then using a spray bottle to mist it onto seedling trays and around the base of young transplants. The antifungal compounds in chamomile create an environment where the fungi responsible for damping off struggle to establish themselves. This isn't aggressive chemical warfare, it's more like gentle biological discouragement, tipping the balance just enough in favor of the seedlings. Amish families often grow their own chamomile specifically for this purpose, harvesting the flowers in midsummer and drying them for year-round use. A single patch of chamomile about the size of a kitchen table can provide enough dried flowers for an entire season of seedling care, plus extra for making actual tea when someone has an upset stomach. That dual purpose appeals strongly to the Amish preference for plants and practices that serve multiple functions. The application frequency doesn't need to be excessive. Spraying seedlings with chamomile tea once or twice a week during their first 3 weeks of life provides sufficient protection. The treatment adds resilience during that critical early growth period when a seedling's immune system, such as it is, hasn't fully developed yet. The smell is pleasant too, much better than the harsh chemical odor that commercial fungicides leave behind. Walking into a greenhouse or seedling room that's just been treated with chamomile tea is actually quite nice, with that distinctive floral, slightly apple-like aroma hanging in the air. This tradition has been passed from one generation to the next through demonstration and oral instruction, with grandmothers showing granddaughters exactly how strong to brew the tea and how thoroughly to spray the seedlings. That kind of knowledge transfer happens in dozens of small ways throughout the growing season, keeping old practices alive without the need for written manuals or extension service pamphlets. Eggshell seed starters. Half eggshells filled with a bit of potting soil make surprisingly effective seed starting containers in Amish households where breakfast means real eggs from the hen house, not cartons from the store. The method requires careful cracking to keep shells roughly intact at the halfway point, a skill that Amish cooks develop quickly since they crack dozens of eggs each week for baking and cooking. Once you have a collection of clean shell halves, they get filled with seed starting mix, 1 or 2 seeds dropped in, and the whole thing placed in an egg carton for stability. The shells serve as tiny biodegradable pots that protect seedling roots while they develop. When transplanting time arrives, the entire shell goes directly into the garden soil with just a gentle crack to let roots escape more easily. Gardeners who use eggshells get to tell their plants they literally started from breakfast. The shell gradually breaks down over the following weeks and months, releasing calcium directly into the soil right where the growing plant needs it most. This calcium boost particularly benefits tomatoes, peppers, and other crops susceptible to blossom end rot, a disorder caused by calcium deficiency that shows up as dark, sunken spots on developing fruit. The eggshell starting method prevents waste at both ends of the process. Shells that would otherwise go into the compost bin or trash get used productively first, and there are no plastic seed starting trays to purchase, clean, and store year after year. For Amish families following the principle that breakfast scraps should work double duty, this practice fits perfectly. The egg cartons that held the original eggs become the perfect organizing system for these shell planters, keeping everything tidy and easy to transport. When it's time to move seedlings outside for hardening off, you just carry the whole carton out to a protected spot and bring it back in at night. The shells provide just enough growing space for seedlings to develop their first true leaves and establish a healthy root system before transplanting. They're not meant for long-term growing. Trying to raise a tomato plant to maturity in an eggshell obviously won't work, but for that critical bridge period between germination and garden-ready transplant, they're ideal. Some Amish gardeners even claim that seedlings started in eggshells establish faster after transplanting because there's no root disturbance at all. The roots simply grow through the cracked shell and into the surrounding soil without ever knowing they've been moved. Whether that's strictly true or partly psychological observation, the method definitely works well enough that it's remained popular across multiple generations and hundreds of Amish communities. Corncob potash. Burning dried corn cobs to create potassium-rich ash demonstrates the Amish ability to extract value from every part of their harvest. After corn gets shucked for eating fresh, drying, or grinding into meal, most people would view the leftover cobs as waste destined for the compost heap or livestock bedding. The Amish take it one step further by letting those cobs dry completely, then burning them in contained fires to create ash that's remarkably high in potassium, one of the 3 major plant nutrients. This homemade potash gets scattered around tomato and pepper beds where it strengthens fruiting plants without requiring any purchased inputs from farm supply stores. The potassium in this ash exists in a form that plant roots can absorb readily, and it doesn't have the salt buildup issues that some commercial potassium fertilizers create. Tomatoes especially respond to potassium applications with improved fruit quality, better disease resistance, and enhanced flavor. Pepper shows similar benefits, producing thicker-walled fruit with more intense taste. The process of making corncob ash isn't complicated, but it does require attention to safety. Cobs need to be thoroughly dry before burning, or they'll just smolder and smoke without producing much ash. The burning should happen in a controlled space like a burn barrel or fire ring, never in uncontrolled piles where sparks might spread. Once the fire burns down completely and the ash cools, it gets collected and stored in a dry location until needed. If your neighbors see you burning corn cobs and spreading the ashes around, they'll either think you're brilliant or performing some kind of harvest ritual. A bushel of dried corn cobs produces roughly a gallon of ash, and a gallon of ash can treat a substantial area of garden beds. The application rate doesn't need to be heavy. A light dusting scratched into the soil surface around plants provides enough potassium for several weeks of growth. This tradition embodies the Amish conviction that nothing from the corn harvest should go to waste. The grain feeds people and livestock, the stalks get chopped for silage or mulch, the husks become stuffing for mattresses or craft materials, and now the cobs turn into fertilizer. Every component serves a purpose, every part contributes to the farm's productivity, and the cycle continues year after year without depending on external inputs. Buttermilk rose cure. Pouring sour buttermilk around the base of rose bushes might raise eyebrows in conventional gardening circles, but Amish women have quietly practiced this technique for decades with impressive results. The buttermilk feeds both the roses directly through nutrients in the dairy and the beneficial microorganisms in the soil that help break down organic matter. Roses are notorious heavy feeders that demand consistent nutrition to produce abundant blooms. And this buttermilk treatment delivers a gentle, steady supply of nutrients without the risk of burning roots. The practice typically uses buttermilk that's gone past its prime for drinking, but hasn't yet reached the truly revolting stage. That narrow window between just too sour and completely spoiled represents the perfect time for garden application. The slightly thickened liquid soaks into the soil easily and begins working immediately as bacteria in the soil start breaking it down. The smell can be a bit off-putting during application, with that distinctive sour dairy aroma hanging around the rose bed for a few hours, but it dissipates quickly and doesn't attract pests the way some other organic fertilizers might. Buttermilk also contains lactic acid and beneficial bacteria that can help suppress certain soil-borne diseases that affect rose roots. While this isn't a primary reason for the practice, it's a welcome side benefit that contributes to overall plant health. Amish gardeners typically apply buttermilk once a month during the active growing season, using maybe a cup or two per established rose bush. For families making their own butter regularly, buttermilk is a natural byproduct that either gets consumed immediately or starts accumulating in the refrigerator. Finding a productive use for excess buttermilk solves a waste problem while simultaneously addressing the rose's nutritional needs. Modern rose care often involves purchasing specialized fertilizers formulated specifically for roses, products that can run $15 to $20 per bag and require repeated applications throughout the season. The buttermilk method costs nothing beyond the price of the original cream that was turned into butter, and even that cost would have been incurred anyway for household use. What makes this practice particularly interesting is how it fits into the broader pattern of Amish women managing flower gardens as their specific domain. While the vegetable garden might be a shared family responsibility, ornamental flowers often fall under the purview of the household matriarch who develops her own techniques and traditions for keeping blooms abundant. The buttermilk rose cure gets passed from mother to daughter, from neighbor to neighbor, building a body of practical knowledge that stays alive through demonstration rather than written instruction. Wood ash pest dust. Sifting ashes from heating stoves over cabbage plants to kill caterpillars and beetles represents one of the simplest and most cost-effective pest control methods in the Amish gardening arsenal. Every Amish household burns wood for heat during the long winter months, accumulating buckets and barrels of ash that needs to be removed from stoves regularly. Rather than hauling all that ash away as waste, savvy gardeners recognize that it could serve a protective function in the garden. The fine powder sticks to insect bodies, damages their exoskeletons, and makes the leaf surface inhospitable for egg laying. Cabbage worms, those bright green caterpillars that can reduce a cabbage plant to skeletal remains in just days, are particularly vulnerable to wood ash applications. The dust interferes with their movement and feeding, and heavy infestations often clear up within a week of thorough ash treatment. Imported cabbage worms, flea beetles, and even some aphids respond similarly, though aphids might require more persistent applications. The application method is straightforward, but works best on calm days when wind won't immediately blow the ash away. Gardeners scoop ash into old flower sifters or fine mesh screens and shake it gently over the plants, coating the leaves with a visible layer of gray-white powder. Rain will eventually wash this coating away, which means reapplication becomes necessary after storms, but that's a small price to pay for pest control that costs absolutely nothing. Some folks pay good money for organic pest control, while the Amish just raid their wood stove and head to the garden. Beyond pest control, wood ash adds alkalinity to the soil and provides small amounts of calcium, potassium, and trace minerals. This means that even as it's protecting plants from insects, it's also gradually improving soil chemistry. Gardens with naturally acidic soil especially benefit from periodic ash applications that help move pH closer to neutral. The one caution is that too much wood ash can make soil excessively alkaline, which locks up certain nutrients and causes problems for acid-loving plants. Moderation matters, and experienced Amish gardeners develop a feel for how much ash to apply based on their specific soil conditions and plant needs. The practice demonstrates how Amish households view every output as a potential input somewhere else in the farm system. Ash isn't waste, it's stored pest control waiting to be deployed when needed. The woodpile heats the house through January, and then the leftover ash protects the June cabbage crop, completing a cycle that spans seasons and serves multiple purposes. Pickle brine weed killer. The leftover vinegar brine from canning pickles found an unexpected second career as a weed killer when Amish women started pouring it onto garden pathways and gravel driveways. This discovery likely happened by accident, someone dumping old brine outside and noticing days later that every plant in that spot had withered and died. That observation got shared, tested, and eventually became standard practice in communities where pickle making produces gallons of excess brine each summer. The high acidity of the vinegar brine burns plant tissues on contact, causing weeds to shrivel within hours and die completely within a day or two. The method works best on young, tender weeds and struggles a bit with established perennials that have deep root systems. But for keeping pathways clear of annual weeds, it's remarkably effective. The brine application doesn't have the precision of hand weeding, so it needs to be used carefully around desirable plants. One splash of brine onto a tomato plant will damage leaves and potentially kill the whole plant, which means this technique is strictly for areas where you want nothing green to grow. Garden paths, the spaces between raised beds, gravel areas around outbuildings, and the strips along fence lines all represent perfect targets for brine weed control. What makes this practice especially appealing is that it repurposes canning waste that would otherwise get dumped. After cucumbers have fermented in brine and been packed into jars with fresh liquid, the original soaking brine has done its job and normally gets discarded. Finding a use for it aligns perfectly with the Amish commitment to waste nothing and find value in every byproduct. The weed-killing effect isn't permanent. New weeds will sprout from seeds within a few weeks, but repeated applications throughout the growing season keep problem areas manageable. Some Amish gardeners save every drop of used pickle brine from spring through fall, storing it in large jugs, specifically for weed control. By season's end, they might have 10 or 15 gallons of potent weed killer that cost them nothing and pose no environmental hazards. The brine breaks down quickly in soil, the vinegar acid neutralizes, and the salt disperses, leaving no toxic residue. Compare that to commercial weed killers with their pages of safety warnings and environmental concerns, and the appeal of pickle brine becomes obvious. The method even has a certain poetic symmetry, where the same cucumbers that grew in the garden produce the brine that keeps the garden pathways clear for next year's cucumber crop. Sour milk compost starter. When milk goes truly sour, past the point where even the pigs will drink it, Amish households pour it over their compost piles to jumpstart bacterial activity. Composting relies on millions of microorganisms breaking down organic matter into stable humus, and those bacteria need moisture, nitrogen, and proper conditions to thrive. Sour milk delivers all three, along with proteins and sugars that compost bacteria find irresistible. Within days of a good milk drenching, a compost pile that was sitting cold and inactive will heat up dramatically as bacterial populations explode and decomposition accelerates. The practice works particularly well for starting new compost piles or reviving old ones that have gone dormant. A gallon of truly spoiled milk spread over a cubic yard of fresh garden waste and kitchen scraps can reduce the time to finish compost by weeks or even months. The milk doesn't need to be evenly distributed or measured precisely. Rough application works fine since bacteria will multiply and spread throughout the pile naturally. Some gardeners worry about the smell of pouring rotten milk onto compost, and yes, the immediate effect is memorable, but the odor fades within a day as bacteria consume the proteins and the pile temperature rises. Once active decomposition takes hold, the compost pile actually smells less offensive than it would have without the milk addition. Temperature increases also kill more weed seeds and disease pathogens, improving the final compost quality. This represents another example of Amish households refusing to see any kitchen item as true waste. Milk that's spoiled beyond all other possible uses still has value as a compost amendment, which means the cow's milk serves purposes even after it's gone completely bad. For families milking their own cows, this matters because milk production doesn't always match consumption perfectly. Sometimes there's extra, sometimes it doesn't get used quickly enough, and having a productive destination for spoiled milk prevents the guilt of dumping it down the drain. The nitrogen content in milk is particularly valuable for composting carbon-rich materials like autumn leaves, straw, or wood chips. These materials break down slowly because they lack sufficient nitrogen for bacterial activity, but adding sour milk balances the carbon-to-nitrogen ratio and speeds decomposition dramatically. Finished compost made with milk additions tends to be darker, richer, and more friable than compost made without any animal-based inputs. It crumbles beautifully when you run it through your fingers and has that earthy, forest floor smell that signals properly decomposed organic matter. Spread this finished compost over garden beds in fall or early spring, and you're essentially recycling that spoiled milk back into nutrients that will grow next season's crops. Breadcrumb ant bait. Soaking breadcrumbs in molasses to lure ants might sound more like a failed dessert recipe than pest control, but Amish households discovered this method works surprisingly well for managing ant invasions. The technique targets those times when ants find their way into summer kitchens or start farming aphids on garden plants, situations where you need to reduce ant populations quickly. The breadcrumbs provide texture and surface area that holds the molasses, creating clumps of irresistible bait that ants swarm over in impressive numbers. Once a scout ant finds the bait, it returns to the colony and communicates the food source location, which brings out massive numbers of workers. Within an hour, hundreds of ants will be clustered on and around the bread molasses mixture, too focused on the sweet feast to notice anything else. This is when the collection happens. Amish women scoop up the ant-covered bait with a spoon or small shovel and dump everything into a bucket of water where the ants drown quickly. The process gets repeated daily until ant activity drops to manageable levels, which usually takes less than a week of persistent baiting and drowning. The method lacks the one-and-done convenience of commercial ant baits, but makes up for it in cost and safety. Commercial ant baits often contain boric acid or other poisons that, while relatively safe, still carry some risk around children and pets. Bread and molasses present zero toxicity issues, and even if a dog eats the bait before the ants find it, the worst consequence is a slightly sticky muzzle. The technique works best for outdoor ant control where drowning the collected ants is practical. Indoor applications become messier and less appealing, though desperate situations might call for desperate measures. Summer kitchens, those separate cooking buildings that keep heat out of the main house, occasionally see ant problems as the insects investigate food smells and spills. Setting out bread molasses, bait in corners, and along ant trails helps identify the worst entry points while simultaneously reducing the population. Some folks might consider this method strange or unnecessarily elaborate when ant spray costs just a few dollars, but remember the Amish framework of using what you have, avoiding unnecessary purchases, and keeping chemicals out of living spaces. Bread that's gone stale enough to be unpleasant for eating still works perfectly for ant bait, and molasses stays in every Amish pantry year-round. The approach reflects that fundamental question that underlies so many Amish practices: why buy something when you can solve the problem with items already at hand? Sawdust row covers. Spreading thick layers of sawdust over newly planted garden rows in spring provides surprisingly effective protection against surprise late frosts. The Amish carpenter shops and furniture-making operations produce sawdust in massive quantities, far more than could ever be used for animal bedding alone. Rather than viewing this sawdust as waste to be disposed of, Amish communities distribute it to families who use it for everything from workshop floors to garden mulch. The frost protection application takes advantage of sawdust's insulating properties and its ability to trap air, creating a protective blanket over tender seedlings. When weather forecasts warn of overnight temperatures dropping into the danger zone, gardeners shovel sawdust 2 to 3 inches thick directly over rows of beans, squash, tomatoes, or other frost-sensitive plants. The timing matters quite a bit. Applications work best in late afternoon before temperatures start falling, giving the sawdust time to settle into place. By morning, even if temperatures have dipped below freezing, the plants underneath remain several degrees warmer and escape frost damage. The method isn't foolproof. A hard freeze that drops to 20 degrees will kill plants regardless of sawdust coverage. But those borderline nights, where temperatures hover around 30 to 32 degrees, are where sawdust protection shines. Once the frost danger passes and morning sun warms the air, the sawdust gets gently raked off the plants and either left beside the rows or collected for reuse. Interestingly, this sawdust doesn't go to waste even after serving its frost protection role. As the season progresses, that same sawdust gradually works into the soil surface where it begins decomposing and contributing organic matter. By season's end, most of it has broken down enough to be turned under during fall soil preparation. The carbon content in sawdust does temporarily tie up soil nitrogen as decomposition happens, but Amish gardeners account for this by applying extra compost or manure in areas where sawdust mulching was heavy. The continuous supply of fresh sawdust from carpenter shops means there's never a shortage for garden use. Bags and wheelbarrows of sawdust get distributed to neighbors, relatives, and anyone who asks, creating another thread in the web of mutual support that characterizes Amish communities. One family's furniture-making byproduct becomes another family's garden protection, and everyone benefits from the arrangement. The practice highlights how Amish agriculture operates on interconnected cycles where waste from one enterprise feeds into another, minimizing inputs from outside the community while maximizing productivity. Dandelion root soil tonic. Chopping dandelion roots and burying them in tired garden beds turns conventional wisdom about weeds completely upside down. Most gardeners view dandelions as the enemy, something to be eradicated with prejudice from lawns and gardens. The Amish take a different approach, recognizing that these persistent plants accumulate minerals from deep underground through their extensive taproots. Dandelions send roots down 2 feet or more, reaching soil layers that shallow-rooted garden vegetables never access. As those deep roots pull up calcium, potassium, magnesium, and trace minerals, the nutrients concentrate in root tissues. When you dig up dandelion roots, chop them into pieces, and bury them in garden soil. Those minerals become available as the roots decompose. The process essentially mines nutrients from the subsoil and relocates them into the active root zone where garden plants can benefit. This practice works especially well in beds that have been in continuous production for years and are starting to show signs of depletion despite regular compost additions. Sometimes soil just needs an influx of minerals that organic matter alone can't provide, and dandelion roots deliver exactly that. The collection typically happens in early spring or late fall, when dandelions are actively growing but before they've set seed. A digging fork makes quick work of lifting dandelions with their roots intact, and a machete, or heavy knife, chops those roots into 2 to 3 inch sections. These pieces get worked into the soil 6 to 8 inches deep, roughly where most vegetable roots will be actively feeding. Over the following weeks and months, soil organisms break down the root material, releasing stored minerals gradually rather than all at once. Some Amish gardeners specifically plant dandelions along fence lines or in areas adjacent to gardens, letting them grow undisturbed so their roots can mine deep soil layers. Then once or twice a year, they harvest a portion of these intentional dandelion crops for soil amendment purposes. It's deliberate cultivation of what others call a weed, and it demonstrates the Amish ability to see value where conventional thinking sees only problems. The folk wisdom surrounding this practice holds that crops grown in soil amended with dandelion roots taste better and show improved vigor. Whether that's measurable science or observational bias is hard to say, but the mineral enrichment aspect is real enough. Laboratory analysis of dandelion roots confirms they contain significantly higher concentrations of certain minerals compared to surrounding soil, which validates what Amish gardeners figured out through generations of experimentation. The beauty of this method lies in how it costs nothing and requires no special equipment beyond basic digging tools. Dandelions grow everywhere without encouragement, which means the raw material for this soil amendment is literally free for the taking. Some suburban gardeners spend considerable money on mineral supplements and rock dust products designed to remineralize depleted soils, while Amish families accomplish the same goal with plants that most people pay to have removed from their property. From soil care to pest control, these 15 Amish traditions show that the old ways still hold the greatest power. Try them in your own garden, and you'll see that nature rewards patience, balance, and timeless wisdom.